This project is a follow-up to my video on the subject of whether or not historical Native Americans from Western North America would have appreciated Asiatic composite bows. I wanted to ask a related question, focused on the inhabitants of the eastern woodlands. If the native tribes from this rich and complex region had been exposed to medieval English warbows and the archers who used them, what would they have thought of each other? It's a hypothetical scenario, but as alternate history goes, it's actually not that far-fetched. The English colonized America during a time when the longbow was still an active part of their culture. For example, bows and arrows were carried on board the ships of 16th century explorer Martin Frobisher during his efforts to find a northwest passage to Asia. Skirmishes between the Inuit and Frobisher's men saw both sides making use of archery. In one dramatic instance, the Arctic natives gathered up English arrows and shot them back at the European invaders. Additionally, the last known domestic skirmish involving archery reportedly took place in 1642 in Shropshire during the English Civil War. This was over half a century after the foundation of the Roanoke colony in Virginia. Sadly, however, the longbow was undeniably in decline. Apart from some findings of iron arrowheads at Jamestown, which could also have been used with crossbows, it is unknown if military-grade English archery equipment actually made it to the colonies. And even then, neither the archers nor their tackle were likely to have been of the same caliber as they would have been during the late Middle Ages. But putting all that aside, let's suppose that the English had begun their colonization efforts several centuries earlier. If the indigenous warriors from the various eastern woodland tribes had encountered a late medieval English archer, I suspect that they probably would have had great respect for him. The Indians would most likely have recognized the foreigner as a strong and committed archer, and viewed his weapon as a kindred spirit to many of their own bows. After all, both designs were frequently long and powerful self-bows that were used extensively in hunting and warfare. Indeed, the explorer John Smith remarked on the similarity, writing that the Powhatan Indians he encountered would bring their bows to the form of ours by the scraping of a shell. His Spanish competitor, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, related that the natives he confronted in Florida were archers of great strength and agility. Their bows are as thick as an arm, from 11 to 12 spans long, shooting an arrow at 200 paces with unerring aim. Similar accounts from the expeditions of Hernando de Soto claim that the Florida Indians were very tall, and as they have a very convenient height, their bows are very long and large in proportion. They are difficult to bend, and there is no Spaniard who can draw the cord to his face, whereas the Indians draw it even behind the ear and make astonishing shots. If such accounts are to be believed, the native longbow's performance was often staggering. One of the English encounters with the tribes of Virginia reported how one of our gentlemen, having a target which he trusted in, thinking it would bear out a slight shot, set it up against a tree, willing one of the savages to shoot, who took from his back an arrow of over 3 feet long, drew it strongly in his bow, and shot the target a foot through, which was strange, being that a pistol could not pierce it. Though separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years of independent development, all of these descriptions are highly reminiscent of the archery feats from medieval England. Just like the indigenous longbowmen, English archers were frequently men of great stature and strength, wielding long self-bows with great skill. Much like how the Florida Indians would draw past the ear, the author Roger Ascham praised such long draws, as they harnessed sufficient power for long-range military archery. Ascham stressed that, much like the archers at Agincourt, who drew arrows a yard long, one should draw to the ear, achieving full extension. The long-distance performance of one longbowman was immortalized in the Shakespeare play Henry IV, in which a man known as Old Double was able to launch an exceptionally heavy arrow over 290 yards. However, despite undeniable similarities, Old Double and a champion Eastern Woodlands Indian would probably still have had a number of things to disagree about. For example, the Europeans' near-universal use of the familiar split-finger Mediterranean draw is well documented. While the Mediterranean draw was also used by some American Indians, Many arrows from eastern tribes have either bulbous or extremely shallow nocks. This strongly suggests that these peoples made use of a variant of the method commonly described as either the secondary or tertiary release. This technique can still be observed among many other indigenous Americans. It's hard to say what Old Double would have made of this tribal draw. He may have been initially perplexed by it and condemned it as weak, but upon further observation, he might have reversed his opinion and also given praise to the technique for how it gave an extremely sharp and clean loose. There is also some rather questionable evidence that the Penobscot tribe may have used a variant of the thumb draw. Maybe an English archer who had traveled on crusade to the Middle East or the Iberian Peninsula would have been familiar with it. For example, perhaps one of the men on Edward Woodville's expedition to Muslim occupied Grenada would have later traveled to the New World and recognized that some Indians were using the exotic Asiatic style release. But who knows what his opinion of it would have been? The two alien cultures might have found each other's quiver arrangements a bit odd. Many East Coast warriors apparently slung their quivers across the back. For example, John Smith described a chieftain who wore a wolfskin at his back for his quiver. And when Smith was captured by the natives, the Powhatan king was well guarded with 20 bowmen, each with his bow and a handful of arrows, a quiver at his back grimly painted. While not completely unknown, back quivers were apparently rather rare in Western Europe. Most medieval art and literature suggests that the arrows were carried either in the belt or in some kind of belt-mounted quiver or arrow bag. The two sides might have also marveled at each other's secondary weapons. After all, archers were not just archers. They had to be prepared to begin a fight with a hail of arrows, before eventually closing to fight hand to hand. The English longbowmen could have had varying types of arming swords, hatchets, mallets, and falchions. Fascinatingly, Robert Beverly described the Virginia Indian tribes as having wooden swords that resembled the wooden falchions used by the prize fighters in England. There are numerous references to similar edged weapons, such as flat-edged truncheons or the wooden swords of the hostile Monacan tribe. The French explorer Peter Radisson mentioned that one group he encountered near the Great Lakes had clubs of wood made like backswords. Radisson also mentions hatchets or tomahawks, as well as clubs made of a round head, doubtlessly the famous ball-headed war club design. Finally, there are also scattered mentions of weapons that were akin to pickaxes, formed using a club and a sharp piece of deer antler. Archers from medieval England and the eastern woodlands of North America would have probably found each other exotic, bizarre, and fascinating. Yet at the same time, one might have perceived the other as oddly familiar. Whether they met as opponents or as trading partners, I do think that they would have understood, respected, and learned from one another.